مرحبا لبنى. لبنى،
مرحبا، مساء الخير.
هلا مساء الورد. تشيكي من عندك او ببين عندك ولا شو؟ حتى احكي مع الصبية المسؤولة اذا كل شيء تمام، حتى نحل
لازم
المشكلة.
لازم انحط انا از انتربريتر.
اه مش محطوط عندك؟ اه
والله المفروض لا، لانه لازم يكون قدامي انجلش ارابيك تشانلز وهيك مش
اه
موجودة،
صح،
فلا.
مش مبينة، مش مبينة. يلا
لا،
يلا، اوكي عزيزتي، اوكي
يلا
باي.
يلا.
أهلا لبنى، كيف حالك؟
مرحبا.
اهلا وسهلا، اهلا وسهلا فيك.
ممكن أجرب أعمل يعني شير سكرين؟ كيف كذا واضح عندك؟ أستاذة لبنى.
طيب.
نعم، واضح واضح قدامي.
دكتور
أوكي
عبد السلام، انت بتتحكم عمالك
إيه صح صحيح.
هبة، بدي أعرف مين اللي رح يكون في فني، حتى إذا صار أي إشي خلال ال يعني الإيفنت، طلعت أنا برا انقطع إنترنت يرجع يدخلني بسرعة. مين مع مين أعمل شات؟ هبة.
لحظة لبنى، خليكي شوي معي على الخط.
مرحبا لبنى، كيفك؟ روان
أهلين
معك.
روان، كيفك
هيني
أنتِ؟
هلا بدي هلا أدخلك as interpreter. تمام.
طيب أنت تحت اسم أرب كامبين؟
يس.
اوكي، ان شاء الله انه ما بصير اشي. انا ما عندي مشاكل بالنت، لكن ما بتعرفي هلا ان كيس انه طلعت لمدة ثواني بس ارجع، في عندك اشي تلقائيا يرجعني انتربريتر ولا لازم انا اتواصل معك؟
لا أظن هيك زبط عندك، صح؟
لا، لسه ما طلع لي الويندو انه assign as interpreter.
Arabic. هيك to English. Just a minute. هلا لازم يكون زبط عندك. right. لبنى، أظن أنت على واحدة من قنوات الترجمة، لازم ترجعي على
Good morning, good evening. صباح الخير، مساء الخير للجميع. Actually, I would like to thank very much all of you who are attending this webinar. And I would like to give a special thanks for Dr. Zahi, Dr. Graham, Dr. Nilsi, Dr. Helen, Dr. Solange, Dr. Denise, Dr. Lars, Dr. David, and Dr. Abdessalam, and Dr. Biati. I will make more introduction to all these guests for this webinar. Actually, and بدي اعتذر من الشباب العرب، انا لازم احكي بالانجليزي مشان ضيوفنا اسهل عمليه التواصل معهم في الافتتاحيه.
رفعت لو سمحت بدنا نشير، رفعت بس لو سمحت بدنا نشير للمشاركين والمشاركات انه في ترجمه متوفره، ترجمه في اسفل الشاشه عند الشريط بالكره الارضيه، بتقدروا تكبسوا عليه وتختاروا اللغه اللي بدكم اياها للجلسه الافتتاحيه كامله. تفضل.
ورجاء الكل يحط ميوت لانه احنا ممكن نصل ل 200 250 فيعني راح يكون صعب اذا حدا فتح المايك. In any way. يعني also I would like to thank the ACIA Secretariat for being working all over the last 2 weeks in the 5 tracks. Actually putting all the ACIA members in the context of the 5 tracks for transformative education, it was important for us. The idea of organizing the 5 seminars in the last 2 weeks and the regional webinar today is to start as Arab Campaign for Education also to put the plan forward and especially also to follow the Transforming Education Summit, which will take place in September in New York. And we encourage all the members also to follow through the TV, through the all this social media in order to know what is going on, and also to highlight and to be aware about the outcome of the summit. We are in this webinar after this opening. All the members will go in groups also to put a plan where we can also follow all the discussion that happened in the last 2 weeks. Today we invited actually our colleagues from Latin America, from Pacific Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from the Arab world, in order also to see the different point of view of our partner, our colleagues who also part of the Global Campaign for Education and also part of the Education Out Loud project, in order to understand and to get to know different point of view from different partners. It's very important to, at the end, yes, we are working at the regional level, but we are also part of the global movement. This is what we are trying also to push, to have a global movement toward achieving the outcome of the Transformative Education Summit. We will start with Dr. Zahi. Dr. Zahi, actually, he is one of the key educators in the Arab world. He has been really a very rich experience in education, especially in the adult education and popular education. He established a lot of networks, including the Popular Education Network, including the Arab House of the Adult Education, and he is currently the president of the Arab Campaign for Education for All. We will hear how the ACIA see from its point of view the concept of the transformative education and also the context of the 5 tracks. Dr. Zahi, you will have 5, maximum 7 minutes to introduce to the audience your point of view. Please, the floor for you.
شكرا رفعت لهذه المقدمة. بدوري من الحلقة العربية أرحب بالجميع ونرحب بضيوفنا وموجودين معنا. حقيقة نحن بفرح كبير رغم الظروف ننطلق في هذه الحوارية التفاعلية. يجب أن تتعرى ضمن المجتمع السياسي والاقتصادي وخاصة التربوي. تعليم تحولي هو بون أساسية ومهمة اليوم في ظل ضآلة أو محل التفكير التربوي التأسيسي عربيا. وطبعا الصورة في بلادنا إلى حد كبير غير مشجع على الإطلاق، كون نحن هذه التربية المتجددة التجديدية المطروحة تأتي في واقع ايش الحال؟ تأتي في واقع متزايد والقار بسبب يعني
Dr. Zahi, your voice is not clear. I know that the internet in Lebanon is very weak. I think Dr. Zahi cut off. We will go to Dr. Grant Kaswanjati. Dr. Grant is the current global coordinator for the global campaign for education. He has worked in various sectors such as agriculture, health, education, and democracy. He holds a master in business administrative, and he have a PhD in business leadership. Grant's greatest passion is to see strength civil society at national, regional, and global level, occupying key advocacy spaces and being able to make meaningful contribution. Grant, the floor for you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rifat, and thanks for inviting me to this. We are always excited when the Secretariat gets also involved into the regional processes. I think, there's no doubt that, this is the most important time in the history of education, that then, there is the process to put education back into the political discussions, so that education takes the highest spot within the political agenda. This is very important, and I think this has been demonstrated by the pre-summit as well as the summit that's going to be held in New York in 2 weeks, from now. From the GCE side, we have been engaging, with members, as you have seen, via various members' mail, because, we are very much sensitive to this process. This process is very important, and we want to ensure that, GCE members also have good say and input into the process itself. We have gone further to reach out to those that are leading the process, and I think we have been so much privileged as GCE to have 2 of our people into the advisory group, and we've been able to interact and push our agenda within that space as well. So, but something that we have been very much conscious of is not to consider the TASE event in New York as an event itself. For us, we are taking it to be, it is a start of a new process. It is a new day now for education, when education again will be highlighted and it becomes something that we can all be proud of, and we can begin to engage on, and that it becomes one of the key issues. It is therefore very important that if we consider it as a process that we are kickstarting something, it means that it will end somewhere, and we all know that this whole process will end at the national level. And we as GCE, we do have a large footprint when we compare with other organization groups. I think GCE is one of the largest. So we do have members in every country almost, and we occupy many of these spaces. And we are kind of now looking at a process to say, how can we strengthen our members? How can we make ourselves relevant to this process by ensuring that our members are engaging within these processes at the national level? When the whole process of TASE started, the national level consultations were not that very clear. in terms of what was supposed to be done, how it was going to be done. But I think, we have been able to catch up with the process, and we are not going to do catch up again. We want to ensure that, by the time, leaders make their commitments on the 19th of September, we can really hold them to account on those commitments. And in terms of the expectation itself, we're expecting that leaders will make new commitments, not reasserting the old. We want new commitments from the leaders, and we are going to hold them account at the national level where everything else is supposed to be. They have the 5 tracks, that we have been contributing to, mostly through track 5 that was being led by David and others. And it is very clear that we need new commitments to finance education. We cannot rely on what has happened in the past. We need to have new framework that will actually push the agenda of education, and of which, without adequate resourcing, we will not be able to achieve anything. And also, it begins also to call on this process to say, when we talk of transforming education, what exactly are we talking about? I think we also have to be very clear of what that process really is. Say, what is it that we are talking about? Here, we are not talking about reforms. Reforms have come and gone, and there's nothing that has been achieved. Here, we are looking at resetting the education agenda, pressing the reset button, as I'm calling it every day when I'm talking about the taste. We need to press the reset button. We need to change the process on how we define education. We hope that the true nature of transformative education will be very clear, at the end. As GCE, transformative education has been one of the core things in our strategic plan, and this is something that we have been pushing for. But we have also gotten to realize that the current education system will not deliver the transformative education that we want. And then we need to go back and look at various systems and processes within the education sector that then should be able to deliver the education that we want. We don't want people just to know how to read and write. We want them to be good citizens. We want them to respect, gender equality. And all of these things cannot be delivered within the current frame of education, meaning that we have to look at the curriculums. In the Global South, for example, the current curriculum that does exist is the one that was copied from the Global North. It hasn't been really a look of things to say, is this kind of education helping to deliver global citizens that can engage in any space? At the moment, it does not. At least from where I live. I can give you a very good example. I know quite a lot of the Great Lakes of the United States because I learned it in my geography class in my primary school than what I know about Lake Malawi, where I come from. But this is all because our syllabus, our curriculums, were not necessarily updated to reflect on the living environment where we were living in. And this is, we need to change that, our education delivers what we want. And when I'm looking at the process of transforming education summit, I'm looking at, a change in the process. I'm looking at recommitment in terms of financing. I'm looking at governments being able to rework their tax system so that, money is generated. We know for sure that, 85% or even more of resources that are funding education are in-country based. And we know that, there is also ability to raise more. And I think, this is what, we're looking for. We're looking at gender equality to be part of all of these processes. So for us, we are looking forward to the test process, and we are ready at the country level as GCE to engage and to be part of all of these processes. We want education to be transformed. We want education to be, we want to press the reset button. And finally, linking all of this to the World Assembly. As all of you know, that GCE will be holding its World Assembly in November. The dates are from the 22nd to the 24th. We will be continuing with this process of transforming education. We are working on our new strategic plan. that will also unpacks the very same process on how can we redefine education, how can we transform education. And please, if you haven't registered and you're a GC member, please do register. We have invited really exciting speakers, and one of them will be the Deputy Secretary General for the UN, Amina Mohammed, who has confirmed that she will attend also the event. And this will be a continuation of all of these conversations. So we are really excited. We know that this will not be the end. This will be the start, so that then we can really see and deliver the education that we all want. But thank you so much for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. And I apologize for not be able to show my camera because I am afraid to do any technical things. Then I will lose the Zoom at all. So now with Dr. Nilsi Lizarzo. Dr. Nilsi is the General Coordinator for the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education, ICLADI. She holds a degree in philosophy and literature, as well as she has a master's degree in analysis of the contemporary political, economic, and international problems from institution in Bogota. She served an executive secretary of ALER and was president and member of the editorial team in education of Presenza, an international news agency dedicated to peace news and non-violence. She also acted as a lecturer at the University of Indiana, Simon Bolivar, and as a consultant for UN agency and national and international NGOs. Currently, she is part of the Citizenship Forum, Internet Forum.
بس يفتحوا بدك طالعين.
هذا خطيب انا افتكرته ابنه.
إذا سمحتوا الكل يحط ميوت. إذا سمحتوا الكل يحط ميوت رجائي، لأنه في ناس فاتحين المايكات وبيعملوا إزعاج. دكتور نيلسي, the floor for you.
Thank you, Rifat, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody. I'm so happy to be here after my vacation. It's my first activity. So, okay. Education for Thinking and Understanding. This is the title of the event, as well as the meaning of this process that ACIA is carrying out. I believe it is a regional and global contribution, not only to the test, but mainly to the global movement for the right to education, in which we are all committed. In this framework and understanding that the 5 lines are fundamental and inseparable, at CLADE, we have placed a particular focus on the opportunities, risks, alternatives, and impacts of digitalization in the educational processes, not only the learning process. We are also looking at digitalization and its contribution to the protection of the human right to education through public systems that effectively guarantee this fundamental right. Those reflections allowed us to contribute to the Track 4 document prepared for the test, and although the current document includes a more interesting perspective than the first one, I would like to point out 3 ideas that contribute to the debate and the proposal. First, the presence of the digital realm in our lives and in our daily dynamics of coexistence, construction of subjectivities, and others is unavoidable. Moreover, it is desirable if we look at it from the perspective of strengthening global perspectives and planetary citizenship. So, the dispute between yes or no to the digital world doesn't fit, although the decision of specific communities on whether they want to access the digital world exists and is their own decision. Second, the fact that the digital world seems omnipresent does not make it omnipotent. There are false narratives that pretend to put in the digital world the solutions to inequalities, inequities, exclusions, and marginalization in the full exercise of human rights. These narratives' origin does it not come from questioning the access of not to the digital world, but it comes from the model of accumulation and dispossession that is replicated in the development of technologies, a model that is not questioned neither in the 2030 agenda nor in the test documents, and that will not be questioned from those spaces progressively occupied by corporations. Third, the provision of connectivity, access, pedagogical and didactic resources to all sectors, and especially to the marginalized groups, implies paying previous social debts in our region, drinking water and sewage in the most remote schools, energy, adequate infrastructure, etc. For example, giving a tablet to each student, even if it contains open source contents and resources, is not a real answer, since there are side effects such as it does not solve the need for an education to think and transform, because neither thinking nor transformation are individual issues. It enriches those who produce these devices and provide connectivity. It homogenizes contents in all languages. What should we do? I suggest 4 points. 1, we must better understand the phenomenon itself, its actors, dynamics, possibilities, and limitations, always analyzing it in terms of how it may or may not contribute to exercise the human right to education, as well as of all rights. 2, we need to identify and propose regulations and public policies aimed at guaranteeing digital security and data protection. The latter is the raw material of large corporations today, and it will be in the future. It is also fundamental that our states establish controls and limits to corporate offers, aligning them to their own policies and not the other way around. Obviously, this requires strong states. 3, we need to work on digital literacy processes so that teachers and especially students move critically in the endless universe of digital information. Students should learn how to educate the algorithm, which leads them to choose what they want and what they do not want according to their needs, aspirations, and context. 4, we should approach and test free platforms, linking ourselves to existing experiences around the world that are in full development and seeking to attract them to the world of education. Finally, I want to conclude this talk with 2 messages. 1, there are interesting experiences on digitalization. It is necessary to know them better and understand their possibilities to replicate them, but we must focus on experiences from the perspective of educational communities that decide and manage autonomously their technological options and the relevant use of digital technology in the educational processes that they carry out. 2, there are interesting proposals and approaches that have been incorporated in the test track 4 document, but they will not advance if technology corporations and EdTech remain the one who knows about these issues. That is why it's so important that this topic enters our political agenda, so we can study it and advance scalable experiences and proposals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nelsie. We love Colombia. Now with our friend David Archer. Dr. David, he is a head of the Economic Justice Public Service for Action Aid International. He is also a co-founder and former board member of the Global Campaign for Education, chair of the Right to Education Initiative, and long-term civil society representative on the board and committees of the Global Partnership for Education. He is presently the stakeholder convener leading the finance action track for the Transforming Education Summit. He is our expert in financing. He is really our teacher in this. David Archer, the floor for you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for convening this. It's a wonderful gathering, very timely, with just 2 weeks to go to the summit in New York. I will, of course, focus my comments on the financing agenda. We have, I think, produced a discussion paper on financing, one of the 5 action tracks, the action track on finance. The final version of the paper, I think, is quite a radical and bold agenda, really calling for a new global compact on the financing of education. And from what we can understand, that is going to directly inform the substance of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres' comments in his vision statement and in the main finance session with heads of state on the 19th of September. So what is so transformative about the finance agenda that we've outlined? I mean, first of all, it starts from an important reassertion of the existing commitments that have been made to the finance of education over the years, and particularly reaffirms the importance the country should dedicate 15 to 20% of national budgets and 4 to 6% of GDP to education. That's a foundation. That's an absolute minimum starting point. But what we have seen around the world is that many countries are reaching close to 20% of the national budget being spent on education, but they are all still significantly short of sufficient financing to guarantee quality public education for all children. And that's because a 20% share of a small pie is a small amount, and we need to pay much more attention to the size of the pie. So that really brings us to focus on how do you increase the size of the pie, and that really is through progressive and ambitious tax reforms. It is, most low-income countries have a tax to GDP ratio of about 16%. And it is estimated by the International Monetary Fund themselves that countries could expand that by 5 percentage points to 21% within the medium term. Now, if countries expand their tax to GDP ratio at that rate, you could double the spending on education, and you could double the spending on health, and you could significantly increase spending on other public services. Expanding the tax to GDP ratio is the most strategic investment a country can make, because it then provides guaranteed long-term resources for the financing of education in the longer term. If you're going to expand taxes at a time of an economic crisis in many countries and a cost of living crisis, it is clear that the burden of new taxes has to fall on the wealthiest individuals and the wealthiest companies. And if we are to do that, then it's not just about what national governments can do to introduce new tax reforms, but you also urgently need international action to put in place a new global tax rules. And at the moment, global tax rules are set by the Club of Rich Nations, the OECD. That is fundamentally wrong. There's no direct and representative voice for the majority of countries in setting global tax rules. That has to change, and we are calling for a UN tax convention that would actually set and enforce global rules on tax in a fairer way. And that is really the focus of a lot of the work in this finance agenda that's laid out. Is what we really need from the international community is international action to unblock the obstacles for countries to expand more spending on education. For example, that also applies to the urgent need for action on debt. there is a growing number of countries, rather rapidly growing, who are facing a debt crisis, who are spending more on servicing their debts than they are on financing of education, and sometimes spending more on servicing their debts than they spend on education and health combined. That has got to be a trigger for urgent international action to put in place a new debt renegotiation process, a new debt cancellation in many cases, and new mechanisms for working out, for a new debt workout mechanism, which will ensure that creditors also take some responsibility for the bad lending that they've made in the past. There is an urgent need for new global action on debt. It's not happening at the moment, and the Transforming Education Summit will be an important space for the international community to say, if we're serious about financing education, we have to take action on debt justice as well. In another area of work, a critical area of work relates to the macroeconomic policies that governments are following. The majority of countries around the world are significantly influenced by the International Monetary Fund, who do an assessment of every single country in the world through their Article 4 negotiations every 6 months. And the IMF is deeply attached to recommending policies of austerity, that countries should cut their public spending, and the central policy that they recommend for how countries should deal with public services is the imposition of public sector wage bill constraints. This remains the most routine and most widely advised policy in most austerity packages. That has a devastating impact on education, because the largest number of people on any public sector wage bill are teachers, and the second largest are health workers. So if you have to hold down or cut or freeze your overall spending on the public sector wage bill, you cannot employ more teachers and you cannot pay teachers more. That has to end. We've been calling for the IMF to come to the summit themselves, Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, to make a clear and explicit commitment to move away from the use of public sector wage bill constraints as a policy norm. We gather that she has now been invited and she may turn up to the Leaders' Day, but we're waiting to see explicitly whether she'll commit to removing public sector wage bill constraints. That would be the single most dramatic policy for increasing financing of education, because most countries spend 75% to 90% of their education budget on teacher salaries. And that's the biggest single cost in education. So if countries are being told by the IMF you can't increase spending on teachers, in practice you can't increase spending on education. So this is another area where international action is needed to remove the blocks and the obstacles that stop countries from increasing their own domestic spending on education. Another example of this is about the policy advice and the timeframes in which advice is offered. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and others are constantly focusing on medium-term expenditure frameworks of a 3 to 5 year period. And every time ministries of finance look at education in a 3 to 5 year time frame, they think of spending on education as pouring money down the drain, because there is no immediate economic return in that 3 to 5 year period. If you took a 10-year perspective, a longer term perspective, spending on education is the soundest investment a country could make in economic growth and development. But countries are not allowed to do that within the dominant frameworks provided by the IMF. So we are calling for new guidance that enables countries to factor in those long-term returns, even within short and medium-term frameworks. That would be transformative. So look, there's a whole set of areas where the international community, in a gathering of this nature of heads of state, the first time ever that heads of state are focused on education, what we really need them to do is to look at the bigger picture of the financing of education and take action on tax and on debt and on austerity, on public sector wage bills and on economic frameworks. But of course, there's a role for aid and for loans as well. And the focus here is where the key recommendation we make in terms of a global compact is that if national governments are spending 20% of their national budgets on education, and that's a well-established benchmark, there ought to be a clear benchmark for the percentage of aid that is spent on education, also set at 20%. At the moment, aid to education is actually falling, and it's only about 5.5% of aid budgets are spent on education at the moment, despite the fact that most taxpayers in donor countries think that education is one of the largest items on the aid budget. So we're saying 20% of aid ought to be dedicated to education. And we're finding some champions for that position, including the European Commission, who seem to be getting behind that. And if that's true of aid, it should also be true of concessional loans, whether it's IDA loans or the loans from multilateral development banks, regional development banks. At the moment, very little of that money goes to education, and we're saying 20% of that money ought to go to education, because education is the soundest long-term investment a country can make in its development. So we're calling for a radical new global compact, and there's a call to action. There are a couple of things that might happen at the summit, which we are perhaps less happy about, including Gordon Brown continuing in his quest to launch the International Financing Facility for Education that he's already launched twice and hasn't taken off. He will have be given some space to relaunch that, but we don't think it will take off again because it doesn't have the support of any countries other than the UK and possibly Netherlands or Sweden. So we don't think that will happen. It won't be a major risk, but some space will be given to that. I think that if we manage to get this agenda really squarely established at the international level, it radically decolonizes the way in which we think about education financing. It stops the international community thinking, oh, it's just a little bit about spending a little bit more aid or giving more loans. It situates the challenge in the international community to take action to unblock domestic financing. And we will need to keep pressure on national ministries of finance and on heads of state in every country over the coming years in order to make sure that this is delivered, and strengthening the education movement and the links of the education movement with the tax and fiscal justice movements will be particularly important if we're going to succeed in making this happen. But I believe that this Transforming Education Summit could genuinely lead to countries being in a position where they can double their spending on education in order to dramatically improve the quality of public education, and actually, hopefully, in that process, push back against the tide of privatization. Thanks very much for creating this space, Rifat and colleagues.
Thank you.
And,
thank you.
very much look forward to the continuing discussions over the coming period. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Maybe we need to sit with you more than 1 hour, Lorna, to go deeply in all these things, because we need to develop our understanding, to be able to develop a strategy. And I would to apologize for changing the orders. I will give Piati indicated that she has something after 1 hour of the opening, so I will give her the role now. Piati Ogard, she is a senior advocacy advisor for education in emergency in the Save the Children Norway, and a board member of the Global Campaign for Education, where she represents Europe and North America. Ms. Ogard is the former president of SAIH, the Norwegian Student and Academic International Assistance Fund. She really has a wisdom, my friend. So, Piati, the floor for you.
Thank you so much, Rafat, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here amongst colleagues from all over the world, and I'm really happy that we're having these conversations together and preparing ahead of the important meetings that will take place in New York, but that importantly will have to be continued in our regions. And I will speak as part of my role of the European and North American campaign for education and how we are engaging with the different action tracks leading up to the summit, but also highlight a few issues that I think we have shared interests related to how we can continue to hold governments accountable and how we can work in partnership to highlight the situation of education on the ground. And we are really happy that the summit is finally taking place and that it will highlight education as the first time ever and inviting heads of states. We're really eager to see actual commitments being formed, though we're being cautiously optimistic, as we do think there is a need for a strong push from the global civil society movement to make sure that happens. And even if we don't get all the commitments we would have liked to see at the summit in New York, we really hope that we're able to spark the discussion in a new direction in order to create concrete commitments in our countries at home. So from our perspective, we think the summit is an important opportunity to come together and to show what can be done to find new solutions. And I agree with the former speakers and David Archer, who has spoken a lot on the importance of financing, and Nelsie, who has brought up perspectives from our colleagues in Latin America and focusing on the digital divide and also some of the missing elements of the action tracks. And I think from my end and also from many of my colleagues across the different national education coalitions in Europe and North America, we're very concerned about the financing situation and how important key donors such as Norway, where I'm from and representing GC Norway, has made large cuts to global education within the last years. And when major donors are cutting aid to education, new donors or existing donors are not stepping up their pledges. There is a real need to increase funding for education and to further close the funding gap. And especially in light of the worsening situation we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, but also the lack of financing for different humanitarian responses of education in emergencies, and also linking the activities of the summit also up to new replenishments coming with Education Cannot Wait and their launch of their new strategic plan, which will happen on the 20th of September. We're also hoping for increased pledges and financing to address the urgent needs of education in crisis. And we are engaging directly with our governments to put forward our specific demands related to the different action tracks. We do believe that the different discussion papers are a good starting point, but we are conscious about how these will actually play out in practice at the summit itself, and also how they will lead to direct commitments. So, and also the linkage between what will happen at the different days of the summit and how the contributions made from civil society at the Solutions Day and the Mobilizations Day happening ahead of the Leaders Day, where heads of states will come with their commitments, will actually have an important impact. And we're very concerned about action track 1 and 5 in particular, but also on action track 3 on teachers, which we feel is quite ignored in parts of the processes. We think that the first action track on inclusive and equitable, safe and healthy schools, the discussion paper that has been made is a good starting point, but there is a need to think more holistically and to make sure that there is an integrated gender perspective, and also that climate is included throughout. I'm sorry, are you able to still hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Oh, okay, great. I'm just hearing some background noises. Yeah, so the importance of climate mitigation also being addressed as a holistic response throughout the different action tracks, and also the importance of including children and youth directly. We know there's been initiatives to include youth, but these are mainly youths above the age of 18 and not children whose education will be directly impacted. So being able to include children and youth as meaningful actors who will have a chance to actually influence the decision processes is crucial, and something that we are highlighting also directly in our conversations with governments, and a need to also expand upon the youth declaration and to make sure that what youth and children are discussing is not happening in a vacuum, but is something that is brought directly into the summit and part of the decision processes, and not just something to take place at the outskirts of the summit, but actually can provide direct change towards the decision makers themselves. I'm really sorry, but I have to run off to a different meeting. I had some other points to make related to financing, and also part of the digital divide, and some more points related to the humanitarian situation and what we can do together, and also some of the collaboration between our regions. But I'm happy to share my points in written with you, Rafat, and other colleagues in Akia, and perhaps you can distribute it to your members. And I'm really sorry I'm not able to join you for the rest of the meeting and to be part of these important discussions.
Thank you.
But really looking forward to continue this dialogue and to hopefully meet many of you at the GCE World Assembly taking place in South Africa this November as well.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you, Beat. Thank you. Now we will move to Helen Dabo. Helen was appointed the Secretary General of Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education, ASPABI, effective the 1st of January 2021, but has been with ASPABI since 2009. Helen is a lawyer and registered social worker in the Philippines, and has been engaged in education and development work for the last 19 years. She has a track record in advocacy, capacity building, institutional building, and networking in the Asia Pacific region. She has dedicated her professional life to champion human rights as a practicing lawyer, defending migrant workers' rights through strategical litigation and parliamentary engagements. And in her work with ASPABI since 2009, staunchly advocating for education as a basic human right, she has strongly supported ASPABI efforts to facilitate the formation of national education coalition in a number of countries in the region, and co-managed ASPABI extensive capacity building for advocacy program. Mr. Helen Dabo has also served from 2020 to 2021 as a representative of the Southern Civil Society constituency on the board of the Global Partnership for Education, GBE, and contributed to bringing the voices of the concerns of the Southern Civil Society organization constituencies to global platforms such as a GBE. She is currently the CSO representative to the Sherpa group of the Global SGD4 High-Level Steering Committee, a member of the steering group of the Internal Agency Network for Education in Emergencies, INE, and the Transforming Education Summit Advisory Committee. Helen, from my experience with her, she is really a hard worker. She never stops. She's crazy in the work. So my friend Helen, can you come in?
Well, thank you, my dear friend Rafat. You and me both. I know you also don't stop working, as many of us in this really very important meeting that we're having in the Arab region. Good evening from the Philippines, dear colleagues in the Arab region and fellow panelists and education activists joining us from different parts of the world. For this intervention, I carry not only the ASBE hat, but also the CSO representations we have through the UNESCO Collective Consultation of NGOs on Education 2030, or CCNGO, and particularly together with Rifat, as he has also mentioned, we are the CSO representatives to the Test Advisory Committee and the SDG4 High-Level Steering Committee. Now, fully conscious of the limited time provided for my intervention, let me go straight to what we have as CSOs, what we have consistently advanced in our engagements throughout the Transforming Education Summit processes. There's no time to cover all of our CSO agenda, but I'll share here maybe 4 key points to optimize the 5 to 7 minutes given to me, and also to complement the excellent points already offered by my colleagues who spoke earlier. Let me go first. Let me share the first point. We as CSOs have strongly advocated for a real transformation in delivering the neglected SDG4 targets framed within a rights-based, intergenerational, climate-saving, and gender transformative agenda for education. Colleagues, one of the aims of the summit is to revitalize national and global efforts to achieve SDG4. We are less than a decade into 2030, and governments need to seriously commit to and concretize their efforts to deliver and attend to the most neglected targets in SDG4, including on functional literacy, disability inclusive education, adult learning and education, support for teachers, global citizenship education, and education for sustainable development, amongst others, which also have been mentioned by my colleagues earlier. Governments and partners need to put in place gender-sensitive policies, planning and learning environments. They need to mainstream gender issues in teacher training and curriculum monitoring processes, and eliminate gender-based discrimination and violence in education institutions. Greater attention, certainly greater attention to climate change is needed, such as by promoting climate change education being mainstreamed in schools, in youth and adult learning and education programs, and in the overall learning, lifelong learning systems. This will require expanded literacy on climate change and climate justice. Now, second point that we have advanced throughout the summit processes is that we strongly advocated for leaving no one behind in education. Therefore, we reiterated our call, our CSO call, for greater attention and commitment to equity, inclusion, and gender equality in education, including strong attention to those in emergencies and climate conflict-affected countries and contexts. Colleagues, we have noted in so many debates and discourses throughout the summit process the strong emphasis on digitalization and online learning, as also has been articulated by my colleague from Latin America, Nelsie. And we as CSOs have emphasized that the risks and opportunities of the rapid education digitalization must be thought out within the realities of the widening digital divide and the gaps in access to technologies. Therefore, there remains a need, and a pressing need, to develop and mainstream context-responsive, effective, flexible, and inclusive learning options, pedagogies, and curricula that are made available in no-tech and low-tech modalities, such as through media, radio and television, self-learning modules, and those that promote mother tongue-based multilingual education. This for us is very, very important. Equally important is the provision of learning support and further enhancement of literacy skills, soft skills, and critical thinking skills of all learners, especially the most marginalized groups, including women and girls, marginalized youth, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and those living in emergencies and conflict-affected contexts. And for this, and as I speak, let me also put into spotlight the current social, political, and humanitarian crisis being encountered by a number of countries in my region, the Asia Pacific, which impact the education delivery in these countries. And here, let me mention Pakistan, which is grappling with historic and devastating floods that have claimed so many lives and threatens the livelihoods and education of millions of children, youth, and adults. In addition to Pakistan, let me also mention the situation in Myanmar, where it continues to be ruled by an illegal military junta, which killed thousands of activists and civilians, including students and teachers who were calling for the restoration of democracy and human rights in the country. The situation in Afghanistan also needs to be spotlighted, where the education of women and girls continues to be put on hold under the Taliban regime. And I also would like to highlight the situation in Sri Lanka, wherein the country is facing unprecedented economic challenges and hardships, which put the people's lives and education under deep uncertainties. The ideals and discourses to transform education should be set against the realities of each country, such as what I have just outlined from our region. Our third CSO agenda in the summit. We have strongly called for sustainable financing for education that strengthens public education systems and a financing that will truly reach the most marginalized. Our colleague, our expert, David Archer, has already outlined all the nitty-gritty of our agenda there. And as I can also say, as CSO representatives from developing country, we called on member states from developing countries to be empowered and recognized within the spirit of multilateralism as sovereign states and not as bank clients to be constantly offered with loans as the overwhelming solution to address financing shortfalls in education and social services. Instead of loan-based solutions to address financing gaps, we called for greater attention to ensuring sustainable domestic resource financing for education through tax justice mechanisms that have been agreed upon by 184 UNESCO member states in the Education 2030 Framework for Action. The transition toward a strong, resilient, and transformative public education will require higher and sustainable education financing. There's also a need for transparency and greater participation of parents, of teachers, of youth and students, and of CSOs in the education planning and budgeting at all levels, and which brings me to my last point and fourth point. We have called for the protection of the space and role of CSOs, of youth and students, of teachers, of parents, and marginalized groups to engage in and inform the education policy processes at all levels, from community, national, regional, and global levels. We have strongly emphasized this in our interventions, especially amidst an emerging movement or even some coalitions in education that may have greater political and financial backing out of this summit process. And I will end my input with this last point, where I call on all members of our education movement through the Global Campaign for Education and the CCNGO that we should continue to assert our voice in whatever's emerging in this movements or coalitions out of the summit. Any new movement or coalition for education should recognize and build on the existing movements of CSOs through GCE and CCNGO, of teachers through the Education International, of youth and students through the Global Student Forum and other grassroots youth formations, as we have been in existence for many years, for many decades, and we continue to play a critical role in advancing a more transformative and progressive agenda for the right to education. Thank you, and it's been a real pleasure sharing this space with you. And warm congratulations to Akia, to Refat for this important event.
Thank you, Ellen. And from Pacific Asia, we will move to our colleague Solange in Africa. Dr. Solange also is the regional coordinator of ANSIFA, Pan-African Regional Civil Society Education Network, active in 38 countries in Africa. Solange Akbo also is a lawyer and a human rights activist with over 15 years of experience in education policy, analysis and management of development programs, campaigning and advocacy with a focus on gender and inclusion. Solange Akbo has served in various capacities at country and regional level before joining ANSIFA. Solange Akbo represents ANSIFA in many regional and international policy spaces at African Union, at the United Nations, Girls Education Initiative, Global Advisory Committee, and the Steering Committee. Solange holds a postgraduate degree in international public law and a Master of Finance from the Siram Business School, a certificate in education sector project and the program at the UNESCO International Institute for Education and Planning. Solange Akbo currently represents civil society from the Global South, CSO2, on the Global Partnership for Education Board of Directors, and is the African regional focal point of CCNGO Education 2030 Coordination Group. Solange, the floor for you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Rifat, and thank you, ASEA Leadership, for inviting us to join this important webinar in the time before the Transforming Education Summit. Good afternoon, good morning to you all. I want to congratulate you for this groundbreaking meeting. And at the very moment where we are preparing for this summit, I think that it is the time to reflect on what is going on in our various regions and what we want as CSOs under the umbrella of the Global Campaign for Education to push forward. I wish to share some reflection in the case of Africa, of what we want to see to transform education and accelerate progress towards SDG 4 realization and the continental education strategy for Africa. We need to really go beyond the recovery of learning losses that stay unaddressed after the COVID pandemic. We need to reflect on the purpose of education. What kind of profile of educated children, youth, and adults do we want for the Africa we want? What are the values, skills, and competencies we wish to have, and for what kind of development? A Pan-Africanist thinker said, we could not be aiming for a future which is the past of others. The kind of development that has destroyed the environment, brought climate change, cannot be our future, as this model has shown its own limits. We need a paradigm shift, a total overhaul to rethink our education systems that are fit for purpose. When we look at the inclusive, equitable, and safe school action track, we say that all our schools, not only in rural, but also in urban area, all of them need basic infrastructures in terms of school building, electricity, access to water and sanitation. Schools should be safe space for learning. Countries need to implement safe school declaration to stop the increased attack on schools and teachers. The trend is very worrying in West and Central Africa, whereby the end of the school year 2021-2022, more than 12,400 schools were closed. According to UNICEF, 40 million children are not in school in West and Central Africa alone, representing 1 out of 3 out-of-school children in the world. So we need to rethink education that is also respectful of community needs and values. We need to be promoting skills to build a new generation of African leaders. It is critical that the youth is part of the solution, that they are invited on the table and that they are part of the monitoring system also. Youth are innovating, they are generating ideas and solutions and need to be supported with a conducive environment to develop their full potential and contribute to the development of their countries and communities. It means that we also need to look at the curricula. Some of my colleagues mentioned it already. The curricula need to be reshuffled to see how they are meeting the needs of the communities. They are in many parts of the regions in Africa where education is being rejected as imported or deriving children from serving their community. The learning content and curriculum must be freed from the colonialist perspective. Equally, there is need to value indigenous knowledge if we are to transform education. We need an education that develops autonomy, critical thinking, education that decolonizes. In Africa, particularly, with a major part of the population being illiterate, a true transformation should go beyond schools and formal education to embrace the initiative of non-formal and informal education. For our teaching profession, we have a big teacher gap. I'm sure that Dennis will talk to that more in detail. But we cannot dream achieving quality education if countries do not address issues related to teacher training, recruitment, and motivation. Female teachers should be recruited also to serve as the role model that they are demonstrated being up to now. Teachers should be adequately supported and trained to use ICT and digital solutions. Strengthening public education system should be part of the movement, the global movement of strengthening public service, as they are key in crisis management, as COVID-19 has demonstrated. On the digital learning and transformation, I think Nelsie talked about it in large, but what I just wanted to add is that evidence is coming from research that distance learning can only work with some preconditions. We need teachers to be trained. We need parents to be also able to support their children. We need basic infrastructure, such as internet, electricity, and the gadgets. We cannot transform education without ensuring that digital resources are open and can be accessible to all, and that data are adequately protected. About financing, I think that David said a lot on it, and we all recognize that we cannot continue in this loan-based solution to financing education. The emphasis should be put on our countries, how to support them to raise domestic resources to fund education. We agree that education spending is the best investment a country can make, which yields highest return. Let's change the narrative, convince our political leaders at the highest level that they should invest in education. We have not seen any single country develop without developing its education system. And once resources are raised, there is need to use them prudently by ensuring equitable spending, allocating sufficient resources to neglected areas such as early childhood education, youth skill development, inclusive disability education, and gender transformative education. And also, we want to see those transformative solutions be aligned to the African Head of State vision of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Finally, we need to ensure that commitment attests are adequately followed through by our national education coalitions under the leadership and the umbrella of GCE and the regional network, and with the mandate of the high-level steering committee of the Agenda 2030. I will stop there by welcoming this platform created by us here. Let's mobilize our collective effort for a renewed commitment for education and practical solutions to transform education towards more value, right-based and human-centered. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We will stay in Africa with our friend Denise. Denise Sinolo is an education expert, researcher, and African Director of Education International, the Global Union Federation representing teachers and education support personnel from 2006 to June 2020. Denise was Senior Coordinator in charge of Education, International Education, Employment and Research Unit at in the headquarters in Brussels. Denise currently sits on several boards and committees, including the Global Partnership for Education, the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, the Executive Committee of the Education Cannot Wait, and UNESCO International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. Denise is also chairperson of the African Union Teacher Development Cluster. Born in Zimbabwe, Denise obtained a certificate in education from Gawanda Teachers College and baccalaureate degree in educational administration, planning and policy studies from the University of Zimbabwe. He then pursued a master in the same area at the Zimbabwe Open University and a doctorate in education management with the University of South Africa. Before joining the EI, the Education International Secretariat, Denise was Secretary General of Zimbabwe Teacher Association and a teacher in Zimbabwe. And also, if I am not wrong, he is the director of the EI in Africa. Is it right, Denise?
Yeah, that's correct.
The floor of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Refat. And thanks to ASEA for inviting Education International to be part of this very important conversation just a few days before the Transforming Education Summit. I would like to share with you just briefly EI's priorities for the summit. Of course, we are Education International, we represent teachers, so you'll not be surprised that I will talk more about teachers, not suggesting that other areas are not important. They are. We have come up with a toolkit which we can share with you, which we developed specifically for our member organizations. It's an advocacy toolkit for the summit itself. Let's remember that, first of all, education financing remains one of the biggest challenges at the moment because of the war in Ukraine, but not exclusively. Some governments actually taking advantage of the war in Ukraine to reduce spending on education. Some governments would say, oh yeah, because of COVID-19, while it is true, but some are actually taking advantage of the current situation to reduce public spending on education. The data we have from UNESCO is actually discouraging. For example, the Global Education Monitoring Report reports that domestic financing of education has dropped from 14.1% in 2019 to 13.5% in 2021. So we have the biggest challenge. Not enough money is being put into education. And let's remember that in 2015, our governments, through the Incheon Declaration, the Education 2030 Framework for Action, agreed to invest, at least for developing countries, this is important, at least 20% of the national budget in education. That's the allocation, the minimum for developing countries, or at least 6% of GDP. So we need to protect these benchmarks. And at least is very important. We have seen many occasions where at least has been dropped. Maybe because people didn't pay attention, or maybe they thought it was not good English to say at least. So as partners, as civil society organizations, let's protect these benchmarks and put pressure on governments to meet them. And then coming to teachers, Globally, we know it's a figure that has been there with us for quite some time. I hope UNESCO will do a new calculation soon. But globally, 69 million new teachers are needed to achieve SDG 4 by 2030. And of these 69 million, 15 million are needed in sub-Saharan Africa. Many African countries will need to increase the number of teachers by 15% every year, which is a huge task. A huge task. So we have a serious education financing challenge, a serious teacher shortage. EI in Africa is also carrying out right now a study on school infrastructure, and the emerging results are not encouraging at all. Infrastructure is generally very poor, whether we're talking about classrooms, toilets for girls and boys, whether we're talking about libraries, whether we're talking about teaching and learning resources, including textbooks. That remains a big challenge. So we have a serious challenge. How do we address all these problems? As we go to the summit itself, EI will be pushing for 5 key things. Of course, we have every detail under them, but I will not be able to go through the details today because of limited time. First, of course, we'll be calling upon governments to meet the commitment to invest at least 6% of GDP or at least 20% of national budget in education. This is critical. Of course, complemented by official development assistance. David Archer has addressed this question. I was glad, if I got you right, David, that we've moved from 10% of ODA going to education to, if I got you right, 20%. So there has been lack of clarity on what we're asking for, with some of the members of GC in the UK, for example, asking for 15%, which was above the 10%. If I heard you well, we're now asking for 20. So if that is the case, then we need to harmonize our ask across the global campaign for education, civil society, teaching profession, and the youth movements, so that we speak with one voice. So that's the first ask for us at the summit. Number 2, we will be calling and are calling on governments to ensure labor rights and decent working conditions for teachers and all education workers. This is important. I just saw in the chat as I was reading that there is a comment from a colleague who alerts us that in some parts of Syria, teachers are going without pay, maybe for months, or maybe years, I don't know. This is a serious problem. We see the same thing in Afghanistan, in South Sudan, in Yemen, in Nigeria, in the Central African Republic, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and other countries. So it's a serious problem. That's why it's important for governments to guarantee a decent salary for every teacher, particularly in conflict areas. This is where the problem is actually the greatest. That's why EI is calling for the creation of an education in emergencies fund to pay teachers. So this is a specific fund for teachers in emergencies, which could sit within Education Cannot Wait, for example. Education Cannot Wait, for those who are familiar with this fund for education in emergencies, has just developed its new strategy, actually adopted by the Executive Committee last week. It's going to the high-level steering group on the 20th of September, and that's when it will be launched. And at the same time, ECW will launch its education financing mobilization. There will be a conference to be held in February next year. So we need to rally behind ECW and call upon governments actually to support ECW in as much as they should continue to support GPE to complement domestic resources. And then number 3, EI is calling upon governments to invest in quality teacher training and professional development. This is critical. So that means actually strengthening professional teaching standards. We developed together with UNESCO what we call the EI UNESCO Framework of Professional Teaching Standards in 2019. This remains a relevant document, and we're encouraging you to take a look at it and to push your governments to develop strengthen national teaching standards. Borrowing from this document, at least it can help them as a reference document. It's important to attract the best students into teacher education. It's not the case in many of our countries. Teaching is a last resort, or a stepping stone to something else, which is unfortunate. And it's important for governments to make teacher professional development free and accessible to all teachers, education support personnel, and school leaders. But the key thing is that it should be free. And then, of course, pedagogy should always come before technology. Technology is a tool. It cannot replace teachers. So teachers need skills, but also they need digital infrastructure for them to be able to use technology to support teaching and learning. Number 4 here is calling for trust and respect for teachers, particularly for their pedagogical expertise. This is important because quite often today, teachers are subjected to too much control, standardized assessments, or a standardized curriculum, which leaves no room for creativity or initiative. Sometimes teachers are given lesson plans on tablets and asked just to read in front of students. This takes away their professional autonomy. It takes away academic freedom. So that's why we're calling for respect for teachers, we're calling for autonomy. And then number 5, which is the last major ask from us, it is actually for governments to ensure that teachers and, of course, civil society, student youth groups are involved in policy dialogue. And in the case of teachers, we would like teachers to be involved in social dialogue. This is critical so that they can participate in decision-making processes on education, but also in the improvement of their working conditions. Here's what I would like to leave you with in conclusion. First of all, our governments need to demonstrate political will and commitment by meeting SDG 4 commitments and the strategies which are well articulated in the Education 2030 Framework for Action. In other words, we already have commitments, but they are not being met. So that is the most important thing. And then number 2, they should close the gap between policy and practice. Good documents, but no implementation, no action on the ground. That should be attended to. And finally, governments should take concrete policy, legislative, and financing measures to ensure a highly trained, professionally qualified, and motivated teacher for every child. In other words, every child everywhere needs a qualified teacher. That's our message to the UN Summit in a few days' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis. What you have been introduced is very important. I hope that the groups will take it to the discussion. أرجو من الكل يحط ميوت لأنه في دائما بس تحكي إذا مش حاطة ميوت يعني بشوش على المتحدث. Now, from African, we will go back to, we will come to Palestine. Where is Mr. Lars Otzholt is there now. Mr. Lars spans robust management and leadership experience as well as substantial insight from development-related assignment across the 3 continents. 30 years of postgraduate experience from development work has enabled Lars to effectively leverage his academic background and translated lifelong commitment to development into high-level professional performance. He has led organization through complex transitions and is conversant with leadership challenges in multicultural environments. A substantial part of his professional career has revolved around the role of civil society and North-South partnership. Lars holds extensive experience in the field of policy, advocacy, and the opportunities and challenges for civil society organization when engaging with other society actors around wider policy agenda. He furthermore offers particular insight in the role of multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and UN specialized agencies. Also, Lars, he is the General Director of the Education Out Loud project, where he has to work daily by night in order to be able to follow all these. Lars, welcome, and welcome also that you are in Palestine, and we hope that we will give you passport citizenship. Lars, the floor for you.
Thank you so much, Rifat, and thanks to yourself and certainly to ACARE colleagues for setting up this very important session today. Unlike other colleagues, I will not talk about an agenda addressed to the actual meeting in New York coming up shortly, but I will talk about what it takes for a facility like Education Out Loud to address the concerns reflected in this agenda. So I'll have a slightly more narrow perspective. I was wondering if there's any chance that I could possibly share my screen because I had a presentation, but otherwise I will just go through. But if there's a chance to share, I would be glad to do that. Heba, was that possible?
Yes, you have access, Lars. You could do it. We have activated it.
Okay, good. Now I have it here, so just a moment, I will be there. Yeah, so Education Out Loud is what keeps me and quite a few other people busy. I will not talk at length about Education Out Loud. Many of you attending the call today will have some idea about what it is, but I will talk about the assumption underlying my presentation, namely that if education should lead to enhanced thinking and understanding, then it requires that we all are conversant of moving beyond project modalities. We can't work with boxes trying to put the reality into a simple project. Certainly, the second point is that we need many stakeholders involved. We can't just believe that each of us is capable of achieving this. And finally, I also would advise that we are not exclusively focusing on policies, also concerned with how policies are being implemented. And I believe that many civil society organizations are actually capable of exactly pinpointing at weaknesses or strengths in implementation, because that is the lived realities to which civil society organizations are indeed very experienced. Let me just briefly say, what does Education Out Loud, EOL, actually support? Well, we do support currently around 80 different projects undertaken by civil society organizations. And of course, you can say with so many different projects supported, there is a risk of fragmentation, of the big puzzle being cut into many small bits and pieces. But we also are expectant that grantees receiving support from Education Out Loud are eager to work not just with their own project, but are able and happy to reach out to colleagues elsewhere in the education movement. Then we can have the potential for a more systemic scope of our efforts. And finally, it is important to say that projects supported with funding from Education Out Loud have as an integral part of the project design strong components to promote reflection and learning. Our expectations are that such components to promote learning will lead both to improved implementation of the respective projects, but also that Education Out Loud thereby can help stimulate wider lessons that cuts across the individual efforts that each of us are engaged with. So hopefully the measures that I have outlined here will enable us to address efforts at a more systemic level. So how do we support grantees from the Education Out Loud perspective? Well, first and foremost, we work strongly with a bottom-up approach. We believe that the projects designed by applicants to Education Out Loud should not be informed by the vision of Mr. Lars or Mr. Karan or Mr. Richard or whoever. They should be informed by the very local context. And therefore, we are not requiring applicants to Education Out Loud to fit their aspirations into a tight overall results framework. In fact, in Education Out Loud, we are proud that we're able to support 80 different theories of change and results framework. We do require applicants to undergo a due diligence assessment, but we emphasize that this assessment is based on a self-assessment that each of the applicants would go through. We hope thereby not only to enhance project management and thereby reduce risks, but we also hope that results of these assessments, these due diligence assessments, DDA, will serve as a very important input to learning plans drawn up by individual applicants to address and improve identified bottlenecks in our respective organizations. So for Education Out Loud, we are trying to, on the one hand, accept and appreciate diversity, but also striving to achieve transformation by looking across these many, many different realities to look for a more shared and common vision across the education community. So I do hope that the aspirations of the very many different ACIA stakeholders assembled in this call today is also put together in around a common and shared vision. Finally, let me just address some challenges that are also something that we must confront. In Education Out Loud, we talk proudly about mutual accountability. But if we talk about mutual accountability, it actually assumes that we do share the same agenda. So again, it is a call for spending efforts to develop a shared vision so that we don't speak in different directions, to the north, to the east, to the south, to the west. It's also important that we move beyond talking about getting as many children into the classrooms as possible. We must also address the severe effects of marginalization and thereby picking up the agenda from the SDG framework to leave no one behind. We also believe that we should talk not only about the availability of financing, but also use the position of civil society activists to monitor the use of this financing. Is it actually entering the intended beneficiaries? Is it spent effectively and efficiently? So we need to monitor not only the elaboration of budgets, but also how these budgets are spent. And then I believe that eventually we also need to be concerned with the fact that several other speakers have talked about today, the need to address the particular needs for the millions of people who are living in very fragile contexts and where we cannot have standard recipes applied. So let me wind up my presentation today by thanking once again Akia, Rifat and colleagues for this excellent initiative, and also by thanking the strong presentations that have been made in this call by the previous speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we will go to the Gulf, where is our dear friend, Dr. Abdessalam Al-Jufi. Dr. Abdessalam is advisor at the Arab Bureau of Education for the Gulf States since 2011. Minister of Education in Yemen for 9 years. Over 26 years of experience in the field of education, mainly in Sana'a and Ebb universities. Published more than 12 articles in international scientific journals. Authored 3 books, coordinated and participated in many regional, international, scientific and educational conferences, supervised and discussed a number of research papers, and an arbitrator for several scientific journals, contributed effectively to the establishment of university, organized a number of local, regional, and international conferences and seminars, a member of several committees and boards, steering committee, member of the Education 2030, Teachers Task Force, steering committee, alternate member of the board of GBE from 2009 to 2011, member of advisory board of Global Education Monitoring Report, member of advisory board member for the Regional Center for the Quality and Excellence, chaired number of session and meeting for the UNESCO ALISCO. Dr. Abdeslam also, he is considered one of the activist educationalists in the region during the pandemic, and really he was really contributed strongly and effectively in response to the pandemic. Dr. Abdeslam, the floor for you.
Thank you very much, Rifat, and thank you for Ikia. And in fact, you make my presentation easier. I don't know if it's I share screen. I don't know if you can see it or not.
Yes, we see it.
اوكي. اتحول العربيه. اولا يعني الحقيقه انه يعني العروض التي قدمت تجعل مهمتي سهله كثير، وايضا الغيت عدد من النقاط التي كان بالامكان التحدث عنها. في الواقع انه لماذا التحول في التعليم؟ التحول في التعليم لانه فشلنا حتى الان بتحقيق اهداف التعليم 2030 وغاياتها ومؤشراتها، وبالتالي كان لابد من وقفة جادة. أيضا هناك تراجع كبير. تقارير الدولية تقول بأنه 4 من 5 بلدان على مستوى العالم حدث فيها فقدان كثير في التعليم نتيجة أو كواحدة من نتائج كوفيد-19. أيضا المهارات وغيرها من القيم ربما تأثرت كثيرا نتيجة وتأخرت تحقيقها كثيرا، بدليل أنه يعني التقارير العالمية كلها تشير إلى تأخر كبير في قضية التربية والتعليم خلال الفترة الماضية. لهذا أنا يعني العالم والأمين العام للأمم المتحدة وجدوا على أنه لابد من وقفة جادة. هذه الوقفة الجادة هي إعادة النظر في التعليم، ماذا يمكن أن نحقق في التعليم، وما ممكن إطلاقا فقط القيادات السياسية تحقق برغم أهميتها، برغم دورها، برغم أنه مهم جدا أن يكون هناك صوت سياسي كبير وهناك التزام سياسي كبير، بالرغم أنه الالتزامات أساسا سابقة. التزم العالم في 2015 بتحقيق أهداف التعليم 2030، الهدف الرابع من أهداف التنمية المستدامة بغايتها 10 بمؤشراتها 46، لكن فشلنا حتى الآن نتيجة أنه لابد من إعادة التفكير في كيفية عمل المنظومة التعليمية وإشراك أيضا كل الفئات الفاعلة بقيادات وبصوت سياسي كبير سوف دعي إلى رفعه في نيويورك يوم 19. الحقيقة يمكن تحدث كثير من اليوم تم الحديث حول تحديات التمويل، ويمكن ديفيد الحقيقة عجبت ما ذكره ديفيد حول موضوع التعليم وموضوع التمويل، وأيضا ما ذكره الجميع تكلموا على يعني كلنا يعني الجميع تحدث على موضوع التحديات. أنا سوف أختصر في المنطقة العربية من خبرتنا العملية التي عملنا فيها في الفترة الماضية، والأخ رفعت كان معنا في كثير من اللقاءات. حاولنا بقدر الإمكان أن نجتهد لمعرفة ما هي تحديات المنطقة العربية في التعليم. بس أحاول أغير الشرائح. ما اشتغلت معي.
الصوت منقطع يا دكتور.
الصوت ما مش موجود. الصوت كيف الآن؟ ألو؟
لا الصوت واضح. الصوت واضح.
أصبح واضح.
تحديات
الصوت واضح يا دكتور. أهلا وسهلا بك.
اهلا وسهلا، كيف حالكم؟ سوف احاول بقدر الامكان ان احدد يعني 4 قضايا رئيسه في موضوع التحديات التعليم في المنطقة العربية. في حد قاعد يشتغل مع في واحد قاعد يعني دخل في الموضوع على الشرايح، ما ادري من هو، لو سمحتوا.
ما حدا يكتب، حدا قاعد بيكتب يا جماعه الخير، ما تعطوش حدا الاكسس الا للي بيتحدث يا جماعه الخير.
فانا عندنا الحقيقه حددنا بان هناك 4 تحديات اساسيه، هي تحدي الجوده وتحدي الهجره والنزوح وتحدي التمويل ومتطلبات مجتمع المعرفه. ويمكن هذا كل الحديث الذي ذكره الزملاء والزميلات من خلال الساعات الماضيات تتكلم على 4 تحديات. المنطقه العربيه الحقيقه للاسف الشديد بان التعليم برغم الجهود التي بذلت، برغم ان هناك مكاسب كبيره في قضايا التعليم، لكن ما زالت جوده التعليم دون المستوى المطلوب اطلاقا. ونحن عندما نتكلم عن جوده التعليم نتكلم ايضا على مؤشرات حقيقيه، ويمكن المؤشرات المتاحه لدينا هي الدراسات الدوليه واسعه النطاق، عندنا تيمس وعندنا بيزا وعندنا بيرز. هذه النتائج كلها تقول بان في اسفل القائمه الدول العربيه، لا يوجد اي دول عربيه حققت نجاحات كبيره نستطيع ان نقول بانها قد حققت نجاح في مستوى جودة التعليم. وايضا مؤشرات سوق العمل، مؤشرات المنتدى الاقتصادي العالمي، مؤشرات OECD، كلها تقول بانه جودة التعليم ما زال هناك جهد كبير لان يبذل، وما زال مطلوب مننا ايضا ان نتعدى هذا. وبالتالي هذا واحد من القضايا، وهي الاربع القضايا الحقيقه، الاربع القضايا هي مرتبطه مع بعضها البعض. تحديات الهجره والنزوح، الان لدينا تقريبا 5 بلدان عربيه لحد الان تعاني من قضايا تعتبر دول ازمات، وهناك ايضا دول تعاني ايضا من الاثار الجانبيه للنزوح. عندنا مثلا الاردن وعندنا لبنان بيتاثروا ايضا من النزوح وغيرها. وبالتالي قضيه الهجره وقضيه النزوح في المنطقه العربيه تظل قضيه مهمه جدا جدا، وتظل تحدي كبير جانب التعليم، ويظل كثير من الابناء والبنات لا يحصلون على النزل اليسير من التعليم نتيجه الاشكاليات وتحدي الهجره والنزوح. قضيه تمويل التعليم، وهذه هي مربط الفرس ايضا، انه التحدي يعني اذا قسمنا الدول العربيه، واحنا نقسمها دائما الى حوالي 4 أو 5 مستويات. مستوى الدول عندها امكانيات ماليه، والدول ايضا لا يوجد عندها عندها اشكاليات، ودول تعاني ايضا من الازمات، وبالتالي يظل موضوع التمويل. حتى الدول التي عندها امكانيات ماليه جيده ايضا عندها اشكاليه في كفاءه الانفاق، اي ان 90% من الانفاق في التعليم يذهب الى المرتبات والاجور، بما معنى ان النفقات التشغيليه، بما معنى ان امكانيه التحفيز، بما معنى ان التدريب، بما معنى ان القضايا التي ممكن ان تساعد في موضوع جوده التعليم ما زالت غائبه، الى جانب ان كوفيد 19 ادى الى تحدي جديد، وادى ايضا الى ان القطاع الخاص ايضا انحصر اسهاماته في قضيه التعليم، وكثير من المعلمين والمعلمات فقدوا ايضا وظائفهم، او انهم لم يستلموا مرتباتهم بشكل جيد، بما معنى ان هناك اشكاليات حقيقيه في قضيه التمويل. وانا اعتقد بان هذا هو مربط الفرس في موضوع التحدي في المنطقه العربيه. نحن نتكلم الحقيقه بان اغلب الدول العربيه تعاني من قضيه تحدي التمويل بشكل كبير جدا. متطلبات مجتمع المعرفه، يمكن تحدثوا كثير من المتحدثين حول موضوع التكنولوجيا، حول ايضا موضوع القيم، حول موضوع القيم الانسانيه المشتركه، حول المواطنه الرقميه، حول المواطنه، حول الهويات. كل هذه القضايا نعتقد انه في المنطقه العربيه هذا ما زال تحدي كبير جدا. يمكن ايضا لاحظنا نجاحات ومبادرات جيده في دول الخليج، لاحظنا ايضا مبادرات ناجحه في بعض الدول، لكن ايضا على المستوى العربي، نحن نتكلم عن المستوى العربي على مستوى 28 دوله، ما زال هذا تحدي كبير جدا. تحديات انخفاض الكفاءه في تحديد اولويات التطوير جعل الاهتمام دائما يتركز على المناهج. دائما احنا كل ما كان هناك تطوير يروح الناس كلهم الى موضوع المناهج، وكل الناس ايضا بما معنى انه ما زال موضوع المعلم غائب كمحور من محاور العمليه التعليميه. صحيح التكنولوجيا مهمه، صحيح التعليم عن بعد مهم، صحيح، لكن ايضا المعلم هو الاساس، باعتبار انه المعلم والاهتمام بالمعلم، الاهتمام بقضايا المعلم، الاهتمام بالموضوع المعلمين غايه في الاهميه، ما زال ايضا يحتاج في منطقتنا العربيه الى جهد كبير في هذا المجال. التحديات ايضا من ضمن التحديات ثقافه التطوير ما زالت بعيده عن المدرسه، ما زلنا نتكلم على المستويات العليا، نتكلم على تطوير قائم على المركزيه اللامركزيه، لا نغير الهياكل الوزاره، لا قطاعات، لا دمج التعليم العام مع التعليم العالي مع التعليم الفني. المدرسه ما لم تكون المدرسه هي الاساس وما لم يكن المعلم، بما معنى عندي قضيتين: مؤسسه المدرسه، تحويل المدرسه الى مؤسسه بحيث انها تكون قادره، عندها نفقات تشغيليه، عندها قدرات، عندها قدره تطويريه، عندها ايضا مرونه، هناك مرونه، هناك امكانيات موجوده داخل المدرسه، وايضا المعلم يتحول المهنه ليست وظيفه بل تتحول الى مهنه. المعلم هي مهنه، وهذه المهنه لها متطلبات، لها رخص مهنيه، لها اليه تطوير، لها اليه تحفيز، ربط التدريب بقضايا التحفيز غايه في الاهميه. الاستثمار يعني بعدين احنا الحقيقه من المواضيع الهامه، انا احاول قدر الامكان ان اتكلم باوسع نطاق ممكن، ونبهني اذا الوقت ما زال يسمح. توسيع مفاهيم الاستثمار في التعليم يعني ما زال ايضا في المنطقه العربيه غير كافي، ما زلنا نعاني من اشكاليه في هذا الموضوع، ما زال ايضا القطاع الخاص يدخل كقطاع ربحي وليس كقطاع غير ربحي، ما زال ايضا الوقف بالرغم من الثقافه العربيه الاسلاميه غنيه بثقافه الوقف التعليمي، لكن ايضا غابت في السنوات الاخيره ولم نعد نسمع عنها بشكل كبير. المشاركه المجتمعيه، نحن اليوم في مؤسسه مع واحده من مؤسسات المجتمع المدني، اسهامات المجتمع المدني واسهامات المشاركه المجتمعيه والقطاع الخاص وكل المستفيدين الفاعلين من العمليه التربويه التعليميه ما زالوا لا يساهمون المساهمه الفاعله في العمليه التربويه التعليميه، ليس فقط في عمليه التمويل ولكن ايضا في عمليه المراقبه، في عمليه المتابعه، في عمليه صنع السياسات، في الاستراتيجيه، في صنع الاستراتيجيات، في عمليات ايضا التقارير الدوريه عن التعليم. التدريب المهني يربط سوق العمل، ما زلنا اليوم نتكلم على التدريب المهني كجانب ثالث بعيد جدا جدا جدا، برغم انه هو واحد من القضايا الاساسيه اللي ممكن ايضا، لانه عندنا اغلب المنطقه العربيه منطقه شابه، يمكن حوالي 57% من السكان في المنطقه العربيه يعني سنهم ما دون 20 سنه، وهذا تحدي كبير جدا، بما معنى سوق العمل يعني لا يوجد عندهم فرص عمل ما لم يتم تاهيلهم بطريقه جيده. تمويل البحث العلمي الحقيقه يمكن واحده من المآسي الكبيره، البحث العلمي في المنطقه العربيه ما زال لا يحظى الا باقل من 2% من الموازنات من الدخل القومي وهذا ادى الى ضحاله الانتاج البحث العلمي بل الى ندرته. يعني يمكن المشاركه في البحث العلمي في الانتاج العالمي جيد جدا، في قضايا الترجمه، في قضايا الابحاث، في قضايا الاختراعات، في قضايا ايضا التطوير العالمي، ما زلنا بعيدين. في احد قاعد يشوش على الشاشه. مخرجات التعليم لا تلبي طموحات وحاجات مؤسسات المجتمع الانتاجيه. الحقيقه انا في مكتبه التربيه العربيه بالخليج يعني بنحاول قدر الامكان في مكتبه التربيه العربيه بالخليج، ومن ضمن المنظومه الخليجيه باعتبار المنظومه الخليجيه منظومه متجانسه، عندها امكانات ماليه، عندها ايضا تحديات مختلفه الى حد ما، لكن ايضا تشترك في كثير من القضايا مع بقيه الدول العربيه، لكن ايضا بنحاول قدر الامكان في المكتب ان نعمل ما يسمى المواءمه، الاستفاده من التجارب العالميه، زياده ايضا الانتاج المعرفي العربي عن طريق الترجمه. يترجم المكتب تقريبا بحوالي 35 كتاب سنويا، يعني الى نقله من اللغه الانجليزيه للغه العربيه، وهذا ايضا يعني برغم انه متواضع لكن اسهام ايضا جيد، نتمنى ايضا ان يستمر في هذا. عموما يعني احنا بقدر الامكان بنحاول في المكتب ايضا ان نكون فاعلين مع المنظمات الدوليه، مع المنظمات الاقليميه. حضورنا اليوم ايضا يعني هو ليس فقط حضور شرفي، لكن بقدر الامكان نريد ان نتحدث على الاولويات، نريد ان نتحدث ايضا على الامكانات المتاحه، نريد ايضا ان يكون هناك تكامل في الاداء، هناك قضايا ايجابيه ومبادرات ايجابيه في السعوديه بالامكان الاستفاده منها في الاردن، بالامكان هناك قضايا ايجابيه في مصر بالامكان الاستفاده منها في لبنان، وهكذا، بما معنى ان هناك عمليه التكامل وعمليه الاستفاده المباشره وتبادل الخبرات غايه في الاهميه. هذا ما نحاول قدر الامكان في مكتبه التربيه العربيه نقوم به يعني في هذا المجال. يعني نعتقد تماما بان فرصه الاجتماع في نيويورك هي فرصه لكن ايضا فرصه ايضا لاصحاب الفكر التربوي، فرصه ايضا للتربويين ايضا لنشر اهميه او التحديات واهميه عبور هذه التحديات. وعبور التحديات ليس امر سهل ولا هو ايضا، لكنه غايات، وهو غايه في الاهميه ما لم يتم الاستفادة من هذه الفرصة المتاحة، ما لم يتم الاستفادة من هذا الصوت السياسي الكبير، من هذا الالتزام السياسي الكبير، وترجمته إلى التزامات مالية، إلى التزامات معنوية، إلى دعم جهود المعلمين، إلى إبراز دورهم، إلى أيضا يعني توفير الإمكانيات اللازمة للمعلمين. أنا أعتقد بأن هذه الفرصة لا تتكرر مرة أخرى، ولن تتحقق أهداف التعليم 2030 ما لم تكون هذه الفرصة محل تنفيذ ومحل استفادة مما هو متاح. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور عبد السلام. Thank you very much.
يا استاذ بعد ممكن نعمل مداخله؟
لا بدنا نخلص. Now we will finish with the opening session with Dr. Zahi because
بدي اكلم بس
the internet. رجائي إذا ممكن تحطوا ميوت، رجائي إذا ممكن تحطوا ميوت لأنه ضايل الدكتور زاهي. دكتور زاهي إذا أنت موجود.
أيوة
تفضل.
يلا مساء الخير جميعا من جديد. آسف للقطيعة التي سببها الإنترنت. لن أكرر ما قلته في البداية في محاولة قراءة الواقع العربي. بعتقد الدكتور عبد السلام كمان
الصوت زاهي
راح الصوت زاهي.
الصوت دكتور زاهي.
بقترح دكتور زاهي تغلق الكاميرا، اغلق الكاميرا عشان الانترنت ضعيف، عشان يضل الصوت على الأقل.
الصوت هيك أحسن؟
أحسن. تفضل.
ألو.
تفضل.
أوكي. بدأت بالقول أنني لن أكرر ما قيل حول الوضع العربي في بلادنا بشكل عام والذي بدأت به مداخلتي. اختزالا نقول طبعا أننا اليوم يعني في العالم للأسف أبطال الأمية، أبطال تهميش المرأة، وخصوصا موضوع النزوح والتهجير. وهذا كله ليس فقط لرسم سطحي للوضع، هذا يؤثر عمليا على التربية وكل المحاولات التربوية بمجتمع يسوده العنف المباشر والعنف غير المباشر والاحتلال المباشر كمان وغير المباشر. يعني كل هذا يجعلنا أمام واقع أن التربية مستتبعة
زاهي راح الصوت يا زاهي. زاهي دكتور زاهي
يبدو ما عنده صوت. استاذنك انا بالخروج استاذ رفعت لانه عندي التزام.
بيصير ما فيش مشكله يا دكتور. شكرا جزيلا. دكتور زاهي يبدو لي دكتور زاهي قطع معه.
قطع عليه النت. ايوه
رجع. هذا عم ينقطع من عندكم ما بعرف ليش.
تفضل دكتور زاهي. موجود؟
اي موجود.
تفضل دكتور زاهي.
اوكي
سامع.
فبسرعه يعني نقول انه الواقع اليوم هو اننا نستعمل خطأ كلمه التعليم التحويلي. بعتقد هذا للاسف سقطنا في تجربه الترجمه كمان للترانسفورماتيف education. هي طبعا هي التربيه التحويليه، وهذا يعني يجب ان نحسم هذا الموضوع لانه نحن نعيش في صراع للمفاهيم يعكس الصراعات السياسيه وحالات التلقين والتلقي والفرض. هذا نبدأ به لنقول حتى لو أتينا إلى مساحة التربية مش بس التعليم التي تتضمن موضوع التعليم، نقول أنه هناك انقسام كبير اليوم حسم في مجتمعاتنا لتهميش التعليم الرسمي لمصلحة التعليم الخاص العالي وحتى الثانوي والمتوسط. فيها العالمين اليوم بالتربية. فلما نتكلم عن التربية التحويلية نتواجه مع واقع هذا الانقسام التربوي الذي ليس بسيطا، ويجب أن يؤخذ بعين الاعتبار عند الكلام عن هذه المبادرة التي لا يجب أن تنجح في مجتمعاتنا. أقول هذا الانقسام لأنه بالفعل خطير ويطال مجالات كثيرة، جعلنا اليوم فعليا نعيش حالة انفصام شبه كامل بين التربية والتعليم، انفصام شبه كامل. هناك اجتماع مهم وكبير قام بين 100 مفكر من الاختصاصيين في التربية العالم الثالث حول التربية في الألفية الثالثة. قالوا فيه بوضوح أننا يجب أن ننطلق من أن التربية التي كنا نعرفها انتهت في المفهوم وفي الممارسة، وهذا منطلق أساسي سيحيي مبادرتنا في العالم العربي، لأننا إن كنا مقتنعين بهذا فكل شيء هو برسم الصياغة من جديد، لأنه أمام كل هذا الانهيار وأمام كل هذا الانفصام بين التربية والتعليم، يعني لم يعد بكلمة التربية اليوم من وقع الوقع الاجتماعي الذي كان ولا المعنى التربوي الذي كان. لذلك نحن يجب أن نأخذ هذا الصراع المفاهيمي بعين الاعتبار لنبدأ الصياغة النظرية الميدانية من جديد. في نقطة أخرى أود أن نركز عليها. طبعا في كل أدبيات التربية التحويلية، أو إذا شئتم مع كل تحفظ التعليم التحويلي، نتكلم أنه عدنا إدخال التربية إلى السياسة. وهنا يجب أن نرى بدقة الحواجز الموجودة ليست فقط في بلادنا العربية بل في كل مكان. نحن أمام مواجهة بين المضمون التربوي الذي نسعى إليه عبر هذه المبادرة ليس مع السياسة بل مع السلطة بدل الدولة. يعني نحن دخلنا في الصراع التوازنات التي هي غالبا لمصلحة السلطة وليس الدولة. تستقل الدولة وتستقل نسبة الدولة وتزيد نسبة السلطة في مجتمعاتنا العربية وربما في معظم المناطق في العالم الثالث. هذا يعني أن التربية الجديدة اليوم، المدرسة الجديدة التي نسعى إليها بكلمات جميلة وبسيطة وتجميلية، هي فعلا في مكان ما في مواجهة السلطة وفي مشروع بناء الدولة التي تسعى إليها كل مجتمعاتنا، نسميها المواطنة، نسميها دولة ديمقراطية، سموها ما تشاء. لكن هذه التربية تنخرط في هذا المشروع الذي نسعى أن يكون هذا المشروع أيضا لاعبا فاعلا في بناء هذه التربية، وإلا لن تكون هذه التربية على ما نريده. نقطة أخيرة هي حول المجتمع المدني العربي. المجتمع المدني العربي طبعا ضمن هذه المعطيات كلها هو مجتمع ضعيف، له قدرة محدودة، يسعى ويحاول، وإما أن يكون تابعا وإما أن يكون في حالة بناء هذه الدولة. هذا المجتمع المدني الذي يجب أن تكون له المساهمة الكبرى في التربية التحويلية التي نسعى إليها، هو هنا يعني فعلا برسم البناء. وهنا الحملة العربية للتعليم هي فريدة ليس في بناء المجتمع المدني العربي، بل في تفاعلية التي نريدها بين هذا المجتمع المدني العربي والتربية بشكل عام والتربية التحويلية بشكل خاص. هذا إذا ما بسرعة مررنا على هذه النقاط، لنقول في الأخير في خواتمنا نقول أننا فعلا في مسار هذه التربية التحويلية، هي مسار جدلي تفاعلي تربوي سياسي وحتما اقتصادي. هي تربية ضمن مواجهات عامة في مجتمعاتنا. أقول للأسف لأن التوجه العام هو النظر إلى التربية كأنها معزولة، وهذا أيضا ضمن الرؤى الخاطئة الشائعة في مجتمعاتنا، لأننا اليوم عبر هذا المشروع تضع الحملة العربية للتعليم كل طاقاتها فعليا وكل خبرتها في تواضعها وفي طوقها، تضعها بتصرف هذا المشروع، ولأننا بصدد استرجاع المستقبل مع شعوبنا ولشعوبنا وللعالم. وشكرا.
Thank you very much. I was in mute. Thank you all the speakers, David, Solange, Denise, Abdisalam, Yati, Lars, Grant. Thank you very much. And I think regarding the financing, we will arrange with David to see if we can organize also special seminar on the financing. I think we need to go deeply to discuss this, because we have to develop a strategy, especially when it came to the domestic financing, and also when it came to the our campaign in cancelling the debt issue. We have a lot of things to do. Thank you very much, David, for your always insight. It's the noisy voice regarding financing in the world. So, in any way, thank you very much. So I will handle the floor to Mu'tasim. He can continue with the webinar. Thank you for all.
طيب، شكرا رفعت ولجميع ضيوفنا. يعني احنا راح نبدا جلستنا الثانيه، بس بدنا نعطيكم دقيقتين، يعني فاصل هيك بسيط دقيقتين عشان نقدر نبدا جلستنا الثانيه وتقسيم المجموعات. تمام، دقيقتين وبنعود ان شاء الله.
بعدين I want just to thank the translator. I want really to thank المترجم. أنا بدي أشكرها. I want to thank the translator because we took a lot of time more than we agreed. شكرا جزيلا لها، لأنه فعلا يعني كانت جدا رائعة معنا في الترجمة. شكرا.
دكتور أمين تفضل بشكل سريع بس.
عفوا 5 دقائق نصلي المغرب ونعود إليك إن شاء الله.
طيب
5 دقائق.
يعني بنعمل فاصل صغير، بس رجاء أن الجميع يكونوا موجودين. احنا راح نختصر وقت المجموعات الغرف، وهي يعني بشكل سريع، في عندنا مهمة لازم نقوم فيها اليوم ونرجع بشكل سريع ناخذ توصيات، بس راح نطول إن شاء الله، ما راح نطول.
5 دقائق ثم نعود إن شاء الله.
5 دقائق بس، يلا تفضل.
اللي بده يعمل شاتنج يحكي وقفوا التسجيل يا معتصم عشان ما لا.
والله يا رفعت بدها موسيقى بعد هالكم من المداخلات، الواحد صار راسه مثل الطنجرة.
والله معتصم شاطر في اختيار الموسيقى.
والله هلكنا معتصم هلك من امبارح في الليل لليوم، مهمات.